some Bible, I don't know, from one of the Bibles of 17th century. Quite striking visual, resonance, isn't it? So, and it's also quite coming from the point that actually, if you even, and it's the visual comparison in that sense, but if you take the etymological comparison as well, Zeus is called in Greek or in English Zeus. What is the name of the god in Latin? It's Deus. So basically, just one word is somehow translated and transformed in this form. It's basically the Christian god. The whole point that he comes from the sky, and the whole point that he sits in the sky, and he's sort of a sky god, is a direct way of incorporating the paganism into the Christianity. And the next sort of iteration of that, and that's actually the Zeus in that sense actually acts as an ideograph in himself, because Zeus becomes something that represents the power. Zeus is the ideograph of power within the Theogony. So first transmitting from this sort of mediator of the gods, and then the king of the gods, and then coming into becoming the Christian god, the only one god with sort of like set of angels that don't have the same power as him in any form or way. Then we come to this image. And this is another book cover from the 17th century. And the book is called the Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. And that book introduced the concept of the state, the concept of the nation state. And that book was a revolutionary publication, because actually it secularized the power. It took the power from this guy with beard and gave it to this guy without the beard, but with mustache. But sort of the visual transformations are also quite interesting in this sense, because they're still quite similar in the form how they appear. But this became a new Zeus, and this Zeus got new name. Another name that means the same ideograph of power, and this name is called sovereign. He became a sovereign. So now our Zeus of the today, in this way of this transformation, becomes what we call United Kingdom, or what we call these abstractions, these high abstractions of the countries that we're sort of inhabiting, and that's sort of also quite material. As material as Zeus was material for Greeks, or as Christian God was material for the early Christians in the beginning of the new era. And to make this sort of reverse connection back, basically the funny thing that whatever gender is carried by the political leader now at the particular time, at the moment, whatever genitalia they carry sort of in between of their legs, we still deal with this. In the end, Angela Merkel might be a woman by gender, by the physical gender, but she plays the role of the same Leviathan, and she plays by the same rules that are established by the ideograph of power, introduced initially in Theogony in the first place, as something that meant to unite as paternalistic figure the whole society around itself and structure the society around itself. And again, although these people can have completely different political agendas, they have completely different physical appearance and characters and so on, they're actually the same. And that's another point that we are analyzing through this research. The transformations of these ideographs from the past into the current, into the arrival of now. And actually this generic face is something that you see here in this Zeus, and that was the point of the interconnection between of them. But the funny thing, and I will return you now again to this structure, the Theogony itself, the text itself, ends up with the domination of Zeus, and ends up with something that is called the fourth generation of gods, the gods that are becoming eternally young. And this is what I really love as the point of the comparison with contemporary generation, our actually generation of 30-somethings, 30, 20-somethings, something like that. So we are this fourth generation of gods in a way, because we are always young. We're not meant to own anything. We're not meant to. We're meant to only inherit something from the fathers, or we're meant to just go on somehow with this eternal youthfulness. Eternal youthfulness meaning that you're not able to build the capacities on anything on the top and so on. And I would argue that it's not only our generation that deals with this problem now. It's all the young generation that deals with this problem. As soon as they do not inherit the power from the big pater of this state here. And if you would look at the last lines here, we see Athena, Hephaestus, Ares, Eileithyia, Artemis, Apollo. Many of these gods are very known to you as well, because they're coming quite often in the imaginary sort of use, and they're actually images are used as ideographs representing something. But the funny thing about these gods that they're meant to be eternally young, that they're never meant to grow into something else. Athena, for example, that is pictured here, is built in the structure of Theogony as eternal daughter of Zeus, someone who is identified as a daughter of Zeus. She has no identity by herself in a way. Her identity is derived from Zeus, the same as the identity of Hermes or identity of Hephaestus, who is defined by Hera, and so on and so on and so on. And the funny way, if for example the ideograph of Zeus transformed, went through this interesting sort of stages of converting something into another, the ideograph of Athena also went through interesting transformations. So initially being the symbol of knowledge, and being asexual actually symbol of knowledge. She never bedded with any man. She's a Parthenos, she's a virgin goddess. And her womanhood in a way was quite often questioned because of that point of her character. But usage of her image now is very omnipresent everywhere. For example, this monument here, it's the if you've been to Austria, you would definitely recognize it. From Vienna, it stands in front of the parliament, Austrian parliament, and actually it represents the Austrian Republic. It's the sculpture representing the Austrian Republic. And the coin in there, for example, this is just 50 pence, British 50 pence, that also carry Athena in there, representing also something else that is also meant to communicate the knowledge, meant to communicate the assurance, sort of, in the institutional structure of the United Kingdom, and make you trust it, sort of, through the time of this image being present in there. So the valor with which this transformation happens is quite interesting, because Athena, when she became the symbol of republics and she became the symbol of the states, she lost her character completely, basically. She just became a representation of something she's a goddess of, within actually having no character by herself. Although, if you follow her character within the Theogony or within the other texts of mythology, she's quite a complicated personality inside of the sort of events that happening with her in Odyssey, or events that happening with her in Iliad and the other texts. Then another interesting character that also translates, that also sort of transverses in a funny way, is Dionysos. So we have the original Dionysus, and here is what he became actually in the public consciousness. Dionysus has quite interesting stories built around himself in mythology. Some of them are described in Theogony, some of them described in satellite texts, but basically, and just some of them to illustrate this connection. First of all, Dionysus was born twice. He was killed at the moment when he was killed by basically stupidity of his mother, or being his mother being fooled. Then he was killed second time, and he got resurrected also after Hera, the jealous wife of Zeus, wanted to basically destroy the illegitimate child. That's the first thing, an interesting thing in comparison, and I think you recognize the second person. This is Jesus Christ, of course. So first of all, the resurrection. Secondly, Dionysus was traveling all around. The Mesopotamia, and was teaching people things, and he was healing people all around. For example, one of the things that he taught to people all around the world, according to the myth, he taught the winemaking to people, and he taught them life, basically. He taught them the difference between the existence and between joyfulness and between the enjoyment of the process of living. Also, he in Theogony there is a specific line there that highlights the very special future that is somehow promised to Dionysus. But this line is not getting involved in any formal way. And this is another point that we're very much focusing in this research. We're taking those specific moments in Theogony where something is meant to happen, but for some reason no one writes about it. But it's not getting developed in any way or form. The same is, for example, with Athena, if you're coming back here. Athena, birth of Athena within Theogony is maybe the most culminative point of the whole text. It's just, you have a devotion to it of 1 page where it's written that she erupts from the head of Zeus, and all the gods are incredibly scared by what is happening because they know that this is the child that is meant to bring the change to the order. But then it sort of all comes down from this sort of huge energy and this huge event, immediately getting flattened out by the lines that describe that Zeus immediately recognized in her the daughter, the loving daughter, and he saw he immediately loved her and she loved him, and everybody ever happy after, without any again idea of Athena actually having her own identity that might challenge this order of her father getting established there in the structure. Dionysus is sort of similar moment where it's also highlighted that this is a very special child that has this very special birth, because both of them actually are sharing very interesting traits. Athena and Dionysus both are for both of them mother and father, and it sounds really creepy, but it's basically how you analyze, how you sort of derive it from the story. Mother and father of both of them is Zeus, because Athena was born from the head of Zeus, after he swallowed his first wife, the Titaness, the goddess of wisdom, Metis. So he actually gave birth to Athena. The same as Dionysus, what is interesting with him. He actually was killed inside of the womb of his mother, because his mother appeared in front of Zeus trying to witness Zeus in a form and in a way how he actually appears as a thunderbolt, and she got burned. And Zeus took his embryo and sewed it in his thigh. And out of his thigh, actually Dionysus was born. So actually Dionysus also is both the son of the Zeus for Dionysus, also mother and father at the very same time. I think just a couple of examples of something that is happening in Theogony, and something that is some of the narratives that are completely not finished, and something that actually possesses this potentiality to be unpacked further, to be told that story further. Because once again, coming back to what I was talking in the beginning, Theogony is not a truthful text, and that's really ridiculous what you see sort of an analysis of this text within the lexicology or in the classical studies, when the classicologists are trying to understand the truthful interpretation of the text somehow. Well, it's exactly the focus of something that could not be found there in the first place, because the truth there is it's not even a category which you can approach the text in the first place. It's this sort of constellation of the idiographs that are representing our political and social imaginary, and are helping us to structure the idea of how we meant to build the relations between each other, how we meant to build political communities, on which basis of which values, and so on and so on. So therefore, approaching text in this sense, we can actually continue it. And that's exactly what I'm coming to next. I think neurology is a methodology that we use within the Institute, and we use within our collaborations with academic institutions and so on, in order to exactly specify potentiality within the narratives, within something that is happening, and something that actually has this possibility of being unpacked further into something else, but it's not unpacked for some particular reason. In most of the cases, this reason is actually ideological. Why the specific narrative is not unpacked, or something is not really getting involved or written further. For example, why would you write the future of Athena as a possible replacement of Zeus, as she's a woman, as she's incomplete in a way as a woman already, from the analysis of what she actually represents in the real life for people. So it's better to structure everything around the hierarchy that you already have established in your minds, with particular pater, Zeus, with this particular sort of top of the political structure that is always represented in the very same way. And again, we would argue that this particular form and structure of organizing power didn't really change since the before Theogony was written and up to until now. So we're actually living still in this text. That's another point that is very important in order to make this text sort of relevant to us. It's not this sort of form of the text that you would approach from perspective of trying to understand it in relation to the past. It's actually the text that is incredibly important in order to understand our present. And these are the two images that they're coming from the ancient Greek vases, the birth of Athena and Dionysos, both of them, and this is a very interesting kulix also that comes from the Naki Museum in Athens, which actually, in some degree, actually could represent something and could be interpreted not as it's interpreted now in the Naki Museum. And actually, this is also quite an interesting point. Whenever you enter museums, for example, British Museum, or you enter National Archaeological Museum or in Greece, in Athens, you don't really see the history of that past. You see the history of our present. Because, for example, you enter National Archaeological Museum in Greece, and the story that you are told is the story of evolvement of the whole history in order to create Greek Republic. The same way if you enter British Museum, the ancient history of civilizations presented in a way to embody the raison d'etre of creation of British Empire and creation of the United Kingdom. So it's actually not about past, the story that you're getting presented. And it's not about potentiality or not about the stories that are contained within that past. It's about that particular present and making it legitimate. So that's another important line in understanding it. And avenirology is the strategy that allows you to take out those particular potentialities. For example, potentiality number one that I was mentioning before, the birth of Athena. An incredible, beautiful moment that actually has a potentiality to destroy this person. To actually do with him the very same thing that he did with his father and his father did with his father before him. And this succession of events is also incredibly interesting within the Theogony, because Zeus is also not the first and the last king of the gods. Before him there was Uranus, his grandfather actually, who was castrated by his son Cronus. And then his son Cronus went into war with the third generation of gods, out of whom is the Zeus part of. And the Zeus conquered basically power from his father through force as well. But then, after that fourth generation, after the third generation arrives, the history stops. History stops with this. And then nothing else goes further. Then we have only aesthetic transformations of this particular person into different concepts. But basically his children are not getting any voice into anything. They can only become a supportive structures within with the whole evolvement of the society and so on. They're just meant to fit into the frame that is established by this. So avenirology is exactly meant to take out these potentialities and liberate this imaginary because our imaginary is locked to this now in the particular form. We cannot imagine, for example, a political system beyond the nation state. Beyond how can we live in a society where we do not know where we can pay taxes, or how do we can live without understanding what is the central point of the creation of a unit in society if it's not a family, if it's not a nuclear family. How can I not think within the analogy, for example, of the nuclear family, and so on. And this is exactly what we're talking about, because this impossibility of thinking about that is locked down in a systemology of the ideographs that are constructed to support this narrative of power. And this is the also quite interesting excerpt from Hesiod, who wrote the tragedy of Prometheus Bound, actually around the same time as when Aristoteles was establishing his academia in Athens. And the funny thing that, again, if you take Greek tragedy, actually is super interesting in a way of approaching it not as the text of literature, but something actually where those potentialities that were closed off within the text like Theogony and within the stories that were meant to emphasize political narrative and the power, this slips of the tongues within the text like Prometheus Bound open up these potentialities to be actually talked about and to be opened in order to evolve the idea of their potential future. So, for example, this text is ending up with a the tragedy ends up with a Prometheus actually calling for the end of the reign of Zeus in the Olympus, which was actually outrageous to be claimed in the 5th century Athens at that time, and that was already, we would argue, was already a decline of Athens at that moment, because at that moment Athens was already not about Athena, and the Parthenon was not a Parthenon that was representing Athena, it was a Parthenon that was representing Zeus. And also you can trace this whole little elements even architecturally in a city. The temple of Zeus, for example, in Athens, which is larger than actually the temple of Athena, although it's lower, but it's actually was built, it's much larger and it's much more grandiose. It was built around that time, where the emphasis of the Athena as being the foundress of the city and the goddess of the city, sort of the hierarchy changed, and the point of her being permanently under Zeus's eye, not equal, not primer, and something like that. And that was different in, and that is our hypothesis in that sense. That's something that we work with in archaic Greece. Because the Zeus at the beginning of Theogony is quite interesting because of that. Remember I told that at the beginning, actually, Zeus is told about as a mediator, not as a king of the gods. He's told as about as a, it's one of the person who is chairing the meeting, rather than as someone who is representing the kingdom. So those names in here that I mentioned are just a few of the characters from the huge line of the characters introduced in Theogony. Because if you look at this is also not a full list. This is just sort of the people who maybe people and forces and primordial gods that I mentioned that have very specific place. But actually, here you have a bit more, but actually this is also incomplete. There is much more to that than this. There are more than around 1,000 characters, only characters that are called by name within, and some of them are called, like, these are representation of someone who actually, there are 4,000 more names than that. So it's very multiplicit in the point of the potential choice of the characters within the Theogony that actually have potentiality to change the course of the whole story for the future. Because the story ends up, again, with Zeus being established in the end of the text. He's sort of confirmed as the final king of the earth, king of the earth, king of the sky, and king of the underworld. That would never be challenged by anyone else. And there is a last challenge that he goes through, and this challenge is also not getting through anywhere. Basically, it's the challenge that he's overcoming very easily. But these particular characters in here are, all of them are having even if it's written, it's quite clearly elaborated, but all of them also have a specific form that can be elaborated, or could be described, because again, the Theogony is not the truthful text. You can completely use this frame of metaphors in order to construct alternative imaginary, and go further with changing these, not to something else further like that, or not into some other new aesthetic form, which we would argue is happening all over the time. It's just basically the same piece of crap, sort of packed in different new box in a way, and being presented and structured in a new form, in a new way. But to present something new, something authentically new, and that's what we come to the queerness of it. Something queer, actually. Something is not meant to restructure the norm or to create the new norm within it, but something that is not meant to even think within the logic of the normality, or within the logic of establishment of the new norms. And all of those characters in here carry the potentiality of being, for individually, for everyone actually, becoming this point of departure through which they could challenge this Zeus, or whatever is represented by Zeus, from inside to the outside. And that's exactly what we're dealing with in a structure of queering the mythography, by taking out these particular ideographs and ideas of people and opening up the stories with them. And that's what we did, for example, in Athens, where we structured the narrative opera with it's a bit of a funny medium that we invented, where we actually create this set of the lecture performances, but they organized as acts in opera. And if you love opera, go often to opera. Because opera, you perfectly know, it's not meant to be comprehended. It's something that is really so complex and goes in so many levels in a way that whatever you read libretto, if you don't, it doesn't really matter actually. You could have read libretto, it anyway has so many layers of music, so many layers, orchestra, it's all very, it's a very complete experience. That's why I think all the fascists love opera so much. It's just so all-encompassing in a way. But the opera, what is interesting about it, it's very theatrical, a very artistic medium because it's not meant to become understood. It's everyone meant to take something else from it. And that's what we aim with this research. We're not aiming here to, for example, I'm obviously biased towards Dionysos and Athena, and these are obviously my characters that I base the analysis of identity on, but I put my blue chip on, in a way. But it doesn't mean that any other characters are not meant to be evolved. In the parallel lines, for example, or in the lines where the characters are used by many other authors, for example. And in the process that we ran in Athens, we had basically 15 authors that were working at the same time with sometimes similar and the same characters. For example, Athena was used a couple of times, and so on. And those sort of a bit mind-cracking somehow exercise becomes a very interesting line, creating the narrative that does allow for those who did not have a future to have this future. And again, I think making a comparison to the contemporaneity, I think this is exactly the moment where we are now in as well. Because we are not meant to have future. We are meant just to exchange, to change that image with the image of ourselves in the future, to imprint ourselves when we get older or whatever. Or if you're an Austrian prime minister, you don't need to. But anyway, you are meant to structure yourself as one of them, or become one of these. But in order to imagine the alternative politics and build alternative imaginary, our point is that we need to first to do the alternative imaginary before we actually imagine the alternative politics in itself. Otherwise, we're again repackaging the same thing over the time into the same structure. And it deals both with the political imaginary, those it deals with a social imaginary and sexual imaginary as well. Because why also I find Dionysos and Athena such an interesting character, because Dionysos, it's really strange to say, it's really hard to say who is he sexually in a way. He's poly something. It's not bisexuality, it's neither homosexuality, it's neither nothing, it's poly everything. Out of the relationships that he had over the time and over the mythology that you amalgamate in a way, he does not even have a definition. You cannot actually define him as something sexually somehow related to something that we are now trying to normalize again, or trying to make normal within the family. Because there are different ways of approaching queerness in this way. First of all, you can accept the new forms of living. For example, you can bring into the church gay couples, and you can wed them there with the blessing of him, basically. But we do think that it's not really something that deals with queerness, in what queerness means. Because queerness means not to want to engage with this and become one of those. So even my point would be here that we already have gay and lesbian and polyamorous, whatever, global leaders, but it doesn't make them queer. It does make them one of these, the same frame of the structure. It makes them another Zeus, basically, but it doesn't make out of them a new profound form of constructing the social imaginary. And the structure of finding basically your own avatar within this whole structure, in a way, it's your own point of the departure, your own point of entry, allows them to think about the ideographs that I was talking about before, about these ideographs in a new way, about starting to think, what actually do you mean when you say victory? What do you mean when you say justice? What exactly do you visualize, or what exactly can you explain politically or socially or in any other way? And basically, you can arrive to something like that in the structure of how do you actually dealing with those characters, and how do you engage with what they represent. For example, Athena, again, I talked about the Dionysos as a very incredibly poetic character and so on. Athena is the opposite in a sense that she's asexual in a way. She does not seem to possess any desire for the sexual connection, which is also something that is one of the most ostracized ways of approaching now the queer form of perspective and looking at the society building with asexual people as well. So they are, in a way, why they are very interesting to me. In a way, they are at the very edges of the difference of the sort of line that represents what we understand as queer now at the moment. They are not set in this LGBTQ sort of group that is very much defined already, and it's very, I would even argue, normalized already. It's already given a specific form of normality. It struggles on the platform that is actually not platform on which it has a winning arm, basically, or winning bet in a way. It's anyway attempting to get into something that is built in for everyone else to bend under it, basically, to be wed in the church, to be wed, to create the nuclear family, and so on. The question that we ask, both politically and socially from the perspective of norms, what if we imagine something completely else? Or something that, again, that you are suppressing within yourself, or something that you are discovering within yourself, but you find abnormal, or something that meant to be changed, or meant to be normalized, or meant to be altered in any other way or form. And again, Theogony, from our perspective, is a very, very interesting tool for that, because first of all, it creates a good distance from the subject in itself and allows to speak the specific radical ideas through the structure of the myth. And I would argue again that this was actually the structure of how this myth was evolving in itself, with this collective authorship in the end of the day. So yeah, this is the parts that dealt with theory. It might be a bit too much of the overfees or theories in a way, but I hope it was understandable to the structure of the line. So we're now at 6:30. So I would suggest a break, like of 10-15 minutes, and then what actually I wanted to suggest to do as an exercise is to select one of those elements here, what these names. They are quite widespreadly present in Wikipedias and so on, in the very short ways of description of them. And just search for this potentiality with them and connect them to something of those. Sorry, where is it? Those. To those particular ideographs.
Hello. Denis, something that I didn't understand. When you say asexuality, you mean asexual from the sexuality or without sex?
Without sex, yeah. Sorry, asexual in the sense of sexual activity. That's what I mean. Not without having a sex in herself. Athena has particular sex. Yeah, she's. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's another very interesting character that I would suggest someone to try to explore, and someone who no one actually knows, but it's a figure of the Greek mythology, Aphroditus. It's actually a male Aphrodite that has a beautiful woman appearance, basically, but has genitalia. And it's not Hermaphroditus, it's a different character completely. And it was actually also at some point a quite important deity within the Attica. But again, forgotten after that, because he didn't really fit into the whole Christian crap stuff. So you could not really transfer it into some Saint Gabriel or Saint Michael or something like that. Like Athena, for example, Athena actually quite often compared to Maria, to the mother of Jesus. While Jesus is obviously Dionysos, and Zeus is definitely God. And there are a lot of things that actually Christians did a lot of work on trying to transform the paganisms, not only Greek paganism, but what they call paganism, polytheism, into the narrative of the very structured hierarchical form that then gets sort of this this shape in the answer, that sort of structured everything around the one particular character. And again, actually what is super interesting, it's not happening only at the Christian time. Athens started to do it already in 6th century BC. With the arrival of Aristotle, Plato and so on, everything started to go towards decomposition already then, actually. The polytheistic map and the potentialities of yourself defining your subjectivity within the character stopped being possible already back then. And the identifying these sort of tools and even talking about, for example, the subject, what asexuality means in that sense. It's also quite an interesting ideograph in itself. What do you mean by it, actually? What do you mean? Do you mean the action? Or do you mean the gender appropriation? Because, for example, Aphroditeus, that would be asexuality from another perspective. Because both have women and men traits. So that's sort of what is unclear.
Yeah, because there is always a difficulty to understand, because in Greek, in some words that they have here translated, in Greece they mean a little bit different. So for example, they have erotas, erotico, which is here has all the sexual and all this, a little bit different.
Absolutely, and I like also these misconceptions, like for example Eros, in most of the cases, now Eros is represented as this angel that sort of follows Aphrodite everywhere around, but actually Eros is a primordial force that actually does not have any shape, and it's as old in generation of Theogony as the earth herself, or as the sky, and it's actually the force that was meant to band everything together. The love, in that sense, and the power of love, what Eros actually represents, was meant to be the most strong sort of physical power of the universe, in a way, stronger than gravity, stronger than any sort of material things, because they appeared after, already banding together with and actually, in the sense of the language, what was really interesting, because when we were running the reading group exercises in Athens, we had a group of Greek archaeologists as well that some of them speak quite good ancient Greek, and we were actually deconstructing both versions, the ancient Greek version, the Greek contemporary translation, English translation, this colonial English translation, which is coming from 19th century and also have specific things. And then also we looked at Russian translation, for example, to the Theogony, and they're all completely different, and they're all completely ideologized to the nature of the context in which they're translated. For example, in a Russian translation, there is nothing said about attractiveness of darkness. It's very black and white. Russian version is very orthodox. It's incredibly orthodox. It's like very orthodox Theogony. It's like everything is very black and white. There are bad guys, there are good guys, and you cannot really separate it in any other way or form somehow. In a version in the ancient Greek version, for example, what is the one that arrived to us, which is also actually quite premediated. It also was, this is also ancient Greek that probably come to us as late as maybe 11th century. This already, this epoch already. There you have words like mingling in love, having a contract. And so on, these sort of different ways of how gods were created, actually. And some of them were changed over the time, but some of them are actually emphasizing the difference between the importance of the gods as well, and what sort of power they got in the first place. And then that actually affected very much how these gods and their ideographs were translated into the concepts to be used in the political imaginary. So it's really large stuff, basically, but what we find very, very interesting about it, it's really a tool. It's a toolkit. It's like a Swiss knife, basically, that could be used from our perspective, from kids to whatever ages, from the point of just not teaching the Greek mythology and talking about Greek mythology as sort of like a set of Marvel stories. And that actually, Marvel is a horrible example of another level in that sense. Marvel is exactly what Greek mythology is not about. So if it's taking this heroism of the creation of specific superheroes that are having very strict morals that are completely unconflicted in their very basic nature, and it creates a specific form of anxiety in a way, because you would never be that. You would never get whatever power of bending stuff or whatever, or you would never like shoot arrows from your eyes or something like that in a way. While Greek mythology, what is interesting about it, the gods they're human, they're very human. They are jealous, they are doing weird stuff, they are making mistakes, they're dying actually. They're dying and then resurrecting, or they're dying and they're getting chains. Gods, for example, were even punished within the structure of Theogony and the punishment is sort of even worse than death. They were meant to lay without breathing and without speaking and without consuming food for 10 years in front of the river Styx. So sort of it's much more human in a way. It talks not about the superpower star, in a way what is politics of today, basically, and also social structure of today. So sort of you're either Meryl Streep or you're nothing, in a way somehow. But it really talks about the flatness of the possibility of choice of the ideograph. Because also in the archaic Greece, you did not need to actually even like the gods. You could, for example, hate the gods, and you could select specific nymph that would be a representation of your subjectivity. You can construct her sort of character around yourself, or whatever you want to sort of build this dialogue, because it sort of becomes like a self-exercise in psychology as well, in constructing your own identity in a way. And that's exactly the operational mode that we think is very interesting in constructing the ideography. Yeah. Well, let's make a break and